This is the lecture for Chapter 3, The Psychological Approach, a Profusion of Theories. Psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. It arose to answer the questions of philosophy with the tools of physiology. Psychology uses the scientific method as a means of gaining knowledge. It investigates internal mental events such as reasoning, language, and memory, though at different times in its past it's decided that those things can't be investigated, behaviorism being a central example of this. It also investigates external behaviors such as talking, walking, and grasping. Again, the behaviorists thought that that's all we should be looking at. The scientific method is crucial in cognitive science and in psychology. In it, we need to distinguish between a theory and a hypothesis. A theory is a general understanding of how the world works, how a theory organizes a set of facts about the world and helps us to understand how those facts fit together. A hypothesis is a much more specific statement about the world that is frequently derived from a theory. And a hypothesis critically can be tested. If you cannot test it and you cannot falsify it, then it is not a hypothesis. It is not a scientific question. Scientists use experiments to test hypotheses. An experiment must have at least two variables. One variable is manipulated by the researcher, and this is the independent variable. It's free to vary independently. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the thing that's measured by the researcher. It depends on the manipulation. So we have the manipulation causing, and the dependent variable being the effect. That is the thing that's measured by the researcher. An experiment must also have at least two conditions or groups. An experimental group receives the independent variable, or receives the treatment. I think that that's a better way of saying it. And the control group does not. So the experimental group is the thing that's manipulated. The control group is manipulated by not having a manipulation, or not having the treatment. Here's an example. You might have a theory that practice facilitates problem solving. Your hypothesis could be that doing logic problems before being tested will increase the scores on a subsequent logic test. So we've taken the general theory and we've made it into a testable hypothesis. We can generate two groups, randomly assigning subjects to either one or the other. In the experimental group, 20 participants, randomly assigned, are allowed to practice problem solving for 10 minutes and then given a test problem. So here the treatment variable, or the independent variable, is practice. In the control group, there are 20 participants. They don't get this practice, so they don't get the treatment, and they're given the same test problem. Here the independent variable, or the manipulated variable, is a lack of practice. For both of these experiments, the dependent variable is the scores on the test, and we compare the dependent variable to test our hypothesis. Our prediction should be that in the experimental group, the scores on the test will be higher than in the control group. Here we see that the scores on the dependent variable for the two groups are indeed different, and so we look at the scores for the practice group versus the no practice group. In this case, it looks like, if that's a proportion, it looks like quite a robust finding. But we use inferential statistics to decide whether we might see this just by chance alone, or whether this is something that seems to be reliably due to the manipulation. Now we'll talk a little bit about the history of psychology. One of the first movements was Volunteerism. This is a variety of Structuralism. Wilhelm Wundt, who established the first laboratory of psychology in Leipzig, Germany, was the founder. The view here is that the mind is made up of elements. That's the structuralist component of it, like Titchener later on. For Wundt, though, the elements are assembled into wholes through an act of will. Voluntaristic position was influenced by all of the discoveries at this time about atoms and chemical compositions, and so Wundt was really trying to find the basic chemical elements of the brain or of the mind, and then determine how these things are assembled into larger wholes. The method used by the early voluntarists is one known as introspection. This means looking inward. And it consists of subjective self-reports of mental states. So you put yourself in a dark room, you flash a very dim light, you try to record what it is, what the sensations are that you're seeing. It requires a decent amount of training, and it's fraught with difficulties because what I observe internally is a phenomenon, is a subjective thing, and another person can't observe it. We can talk about it, but do we even know if the words that we're using mean the same things? And so that's the real problem with introspection, is it's not objective enough. Structuralism is a continuation of voluntarism. Edward Titchener in America is considered the founder, though a lot of people would consider Wundt also a structuralist. Titchener departs from Wundt's voluntarist position. He does agree that the mind is made up of elements, and he wants to find out what those are, but he figured that the combination of these didn't involve the will, but just passive mechanical laws governed this combination. And that combination gave rise to the higher order processes. Functionalism is the other big school in early psychology, and it really came to dominate the structuralist approach. William James is the founder of it. His Principles of Psychology is still a source of inspiration for many practicing experimental psychologists, even though it was written over 100 years ago. James's focus was on mental processes and functions rather than on elements. So rather than looking for the structure and the elemental pieces of consciousness, he wanted to look at mental processes in terms of what their goals are and what they're for. Now, these goals can be proximate goals, what's the mental process trying to achieve right now, but it can also be seen in an evolutionary context. He was very influenced by Darwin. And so what is the ultimate function of something that we see? An emotion like fear, the ultimate function, the proximal function might be to help us avoid a dangerous situation right now. The ultimate function was to make sure that in dangerous situations our ancestors became alert and did something to escape that danger. James is also responsible for the idea of the stream of consciousness. He thought that you can't really talk about the structures of the mind because the mind is a free-flowing thing. It's not static. And how do you study the structure of something that's flowing? Functionalism won out against structuralism, but the win wasn't for very long, because functionalism also relied on things like introspection. It had started using the experimental method, as did some structuralists. But ultimately, behaviorism came to dominate the field in the early 1900s. Behaviorists like John Watson pointed out that you can't observe these things that all these other psychologists are talking about, and that psychology as a science needed to be founded on observable behaviors. So these people thought of the mind of an organism as a black box. The mind itself can't be studied. All you can do is you can look at things that happen that are stimuli and responses that arise from those stimuli. So the focus is on the behaviors or responses that arise from controlled manipulation of different stimuli. And learning is the kind of thing that you can look at here, the different rates of learning new things. It also allows you to look at animal models and compare those to human models. So behaviorism really dominated the field of psychology from about the 10s or the 20s until the 50s or the 60s in America. There are two dominant types of learning that the behaviorists were interested in. Classical conditioning comes from the work of Pavlov. Pavlov found that dogs would begin to salivate not when food was placed in their mouth, but when anything that had come to be associated with the delivery of food happened. So if they heard the footsteps in the hallway, or if the experimenter walked over to the cabinet where the food was kept, the dog got very excited and started salivating. And so Pavlov then took a scientific approach to this and discovered that you could teach a dog to salivate to any sort of signal. You could set off a bell, or you could play one of the latest top 40 songs, and as long as that song always was followed by the delivery of food, the dog would come to associate the two, and the song became a conditioned stimulus, giving rise to salivation, a conditioned response. The other type of learning is operant conditioning. In this case, we're not so much concerned about associating two stimuli, but about getting behaviors to either increase or decrease. And so in this case, when an animal behaves in a certain way that we like, we reward it or reinforce it. When an animal behaves in a way that we don't like, we punish it. Behaviorists discovered that there were many schedules of reinforcement, but in general, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, both of which increase behaviors, were more successful than punishment, which decreases a behavior. So the human organism, seems to be tuned to learn how to repeat behaviors that lead to rewards, but is not as good at learning how to avoid punishments. Another movement in European psychology was Gestalt psychology. These folks, around the same time as the behaviorists, were arguing that we shouldn't look at the structure or the basic elements of the mind, so they're similar to the functionalists in this respect, that the mind consists of wholes that are more than the sum of their parts. And this is what the term Gestalt means. Their method was phenomenological, and so it required a subjective description of the external stimuli, but they would manipulate those stimuli and they would ask people simple questions or look at error rates. And so it was a bit more objective than introspection. Here are some examples of some of the laws of perceptual organization that the Gestaltists discovered. So parts group together based on their relationships. When you look at the dots in part A of the figure, it looks like a series of columns of dots rather than rows, just because of proximity. In the next case, it looks like we've got rows of similar objects, and that's because the perception of rows is because the similarity goes in horizontal direction. We have other laws of perceptual organization as well. When we see figures that aren't closed, we tend to close them up. When we see two figures overlapping, we tend to think that this is not a very complex, a square with an arc appended to its lower right-hand corner, but rather a square in front of a circle. So that's the law of good form. So these are the kinds of things that they thought that the brain adds to the physical world. It imposes organization on the physical world. Not to neglect learning, the Gestaltists also thought that there were things that were going on that did require that we look inside the black box. And so one of Kohler's studies involved looking at chimpanzees trying to get bananas, and the solution to the problem requires that one stacks the two boxes up, and then you can reach the bananas. When chimps figure this out, the solution then becomes something that they adopt completely. The behaviorists always thought that that behaviors had to be slowly reinforced and built up. And so Kohler stumbled upon something that he called insight learning, and this is the kind of thing that requires that we think about what's going on in the mind. So even though it's been somewhat controversial, it at least points us in the correct direction of figuring out what the mind is, what's going on inside the black box. Another very important psychological perspective is the psychoanalytic perspective. This arose in the early part of the 19th century as well, also primarily European, though by the 30s and 40s it had become very popular in America as well. Sigmund Freud is the founder. His most famous student is probably Carl Jung, or Adler is another one. So there's a series of people that followed up his work. But Freud's real genius is the well, he didn't discover it, but the development of our theories of the unconscious. And so he believed that there's a lot of different little components of the mind that are competing for control, and that sometimes our control is conscious, is something that we voluntarily will, but a lot of times the things that we do, our behaviors, are governed by things that are unconscious. And then between there is the preconscious, which is material that's not in our conscious but could be reached if we try to think about if we think deeply about it. But the unconscious is completely unconscious. It's not something that we can access, and yet it influences us. And so the unconscious is filled with impulses that are things that, at least in the Victorian times in which he was working, people weren't comfortable with dealing with, like sexuality. From the psychoanalytic perspective, we can think of the conscious experience as being above the water, and preconscious as being just below the surface of the water, far enough for you to see down, but then the unconscious is the depths, down in the depth of the ocean where you really can't see anything, where the light doesn't penetrate. And he had three other ideas or primary mental structures as well. He believed that there's a sense of self, the ego, but more importantly, this ego is mediating between two other components. The id is entirely unconscious, and it is all of the basic emotional impulses that we have, aggression, sexuality, things like that. It runs on the pleasure principle. It wants immediate satisfaction. The superego, on the other hand, includes both unconscious and conscious components that are really sort of an internalized sense of our parents or the government. Ideals. It runs on the idealistic principle. It wants us to live up to higher standards. And then the ego is the sense of self that sort of mediates between these two things, the demands of the parent and society versus the instinctive desire for pleasure. A very interesting current variation on some of the ideas that the Gestaltists were exploring. The interdisciplinary crossroads in this chapter talks about the work of Kobovi and Wagamons, and there's a series of other papers that they talk about as well, where they used different lattice types to look at perceptual grouping, and you can read about this, but essentially they discover that the distance does in fact affect grouping, but it's not a linear relationship. The attraction function, as they call it, shows an exponential increase with increasing or decreasing distance. So here are some of the examples of the symbols that they looked at. And so you've still got separation. You've got 4 dots, but you can vary the distance as you manipulate the type of lattice that you're using. This is a good example of how you can take indistinct theoretical questions from the past and turn them into very precisely and quantifiable experiments in the present. For this module, we also have 2 videos, about 20 minutes long each. These come from the Discovering Psychology series. We'll use a couple of these throughout the course. You need to go to www.learner.org, and I've prepared study guides. We're going to do both the history of psychology and the second one on research methods, which will cover most of the material that we've covered in this lecture and in the book, and add a little bit more as well.